There are places in England where history doesn't fade, it waits. And among them, one stands silent still, where music was once heard long after the fire had burned cold. In the autumn of 1873, nestled in the damp, mist-laced hollows of Northumberland, the village of Blackmere lay nestled like a secret beneath the moors. Its stone cottages hunched against the wind, its churchyard moss-thick and whispering. It was here, in a manor house long past its prime, Ashgrove Hall, that Edmund Vale took up residence. Having fled the bustle of London under circumstances never fully explained, though murmurs followed him like shadows. He was a painter of some modest repute, known for his uncanny ability to render not merely likeness, but temperament, the flicker of melancholy in an eye, the weight of unspoken regret along a jawline. His patrons had once been minor gentry, widows with too much time and too little company, children whose innocence he captured with a brushstroke so tender it seemed to ache. Yet by the time he arrived in Blackmere, his commissions had dwindled. His name spoken only in hushed tones among those who remembered the curious string of deaths that trailed his sittings. At first, his presence stirred little more than polite curiosity. He kept to himself, emerging only at dusk to gather firewood or purchase bread from the baker's wife, who later recalled how his hands, though clean, always seemed stained, as if pigment had seeped into his very skin. He accepted a single commission upon arrival, a portrait of young Eleanor Harrow, daughter of the local vicar. She was 17, bright-eyed, with hair the colour of autumn wheat and a laugh that carried across the churchyard. Her father, a man of rigid faith but gentle heart, saw no harm in indulging her wish to be painted. The sitting lasted 3 afternoons. On the 4th morning, Eleanor was found cold in her bed, her lips slightly parted as though caught mid-breath, no mark upon her, no illness declared by the physician. The cause was recorded as sudden heart failure, a phrase often used when medicine finds itself without answers. Vale delivered the portrait anyway. It hung in the vicarage for a week before being taken down. Eleanor's eyes, it was said, followed one about the room. Then came Mrs. Thorne, the widow who owned the apothecary. She had admired Vale's work from afar, and perhaps seeking distraction from her solitude, invited him to paint her in her parlour, surrounded by dried herbs and glass bottles filled with amber liquids. She sat for 2 days. On the 3rd, she collapsed while grinding lavender, her teacup shattering on the floorboards. Again, no discernible cause. Again, the portrait arrived, wrapped in brown paper, left on the doorstep at dawn. This time, the village began to speak, not loudly, not openly, but in glances exchanged over market stalls, in the way mothers pulled their children closer when Vale passed. Yet still he painted, a farmer's son, a schoolmistress, each sitting brief, each death swift and inexplicable. Always, the portrait appeared afterward, as if delivered by unseen hands. Always, the eyes seemed too alive. It was not until the winter of 1874 that the authorities took notice. A magistrate from Alnwick, summoned by the vicar's increasingly desperate letters, arrived to inspect Vale's studio at Ashgrove. What he found defied reason. The walls were covered, not with landscapes or still lifes, but with faces. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, layered one over another like spectral palimpsests. Many were unfinished, mere suggestions of features emerging from shadow. Others were rendered with such precision they seemed ready to step from the canvas. But none bore names. None matched any living resident of Blackmere, or indeed any record in the parish register. The magistrate ordered the house sealed, the paintings catalogued. Yet by morning half had vanished, not stolen, simply gone as though they had never been. Vale himself was found in the attic, seated before an empty easel, brush in hand, his eyes wide and dry, his lips moving soundlessly. He spoke no word for the remainder of his days, though he lived another 7 years in an asylum near York, where attendants reported he would sometimes rise in the night and trace faces onto the walls with his fingertips. Decades passed. Ashgrove fell into ruin, its roof caving beneath snow and neglect. The village of Blackmere dwindled, its young drawn to cities, its old stories dismissed as superstition. Yet in 1921, a historian named Alistair Croft, researching obscure Victorian artists for a monograph on forgotten portraiture, stumbled upon a reference to Vale in a footnote of a defunct medical journal. Intrigued, he travelled to Northumberland, where he interviewed the last surviving villagers, now frail, their memories frayed but vivid on this one subject. One woman, then 92, recalled how her grandmother had claimed Vale never painted from life. "He painted what came to him," she said, "in the hours between waking and sleep." Croft, a rational man by training, dismissed such notions until he gained access to the asylum's archived records. There in Vale's personal effects, he found a small leather-bound journal, its pages brittle, its ink faded to ghostly grey. The entries were sparse, cryptic. "They asked to be seen," read one. "I cannot refuse." Another, "The silence between heartbeats is where they dwell." Most chilling was a single phrase, repeated dozens of times in different hands, as though Vale had been copying voices not his own. "Remember us." Croft became obsessed. He spent years tracking down the few surviving Vale portraits, scattered in attics and auction houses, each bearing the same unnerving quality, the subject's eyes never quite aligned with the viewer's perspective, as if gazing just beyond into some shared elsewhere. In one, a child's hand rested on a windowsill, but the window behind showed not the expected garden, but a corridor of endless doors. In another, a woman's reflection in a mirror revealed a face not her own. Croft began to dream of Ashgrove. He heard piano notes in empty rooms. He woke certain someone had been standing at the foot of his bed, watching. His colleagues noted a change in him. His speech grew slower, his gaze distant, as though listening to a conversation no one else could hear. In 1928 he disappeared. His last known letter, posted from a village near Blackmere, read only, "I understand now. They are not dead. They are waiting." What then was the truth of Edmund Vale? No ritual was ever uncovered, no pact signed in blood, no grimoire hidden beneath floorboards. And yet the pattern holds. Those he painted died. Those portraits exist. And in the few that remain, if one studies them long enough, in the right light, at the edge of vision, one senses not malice, but sorrow. As though Vale had not summoned death, but merely recorded those already claimed by it, caught in the liminal moment between breath and stillness. Perhaps he was not a murderer, but a witness. Perhaps the dead, in their loneliness, sought only to be remembered, and found in him a willing hand. Today, Ashgrove Hall is little more than a tangle of ivy and crumbling stone. Yet on still nights, when the fog rolls in from the moors and muffles the world beyond, locals claim to hear the soft scratch of a brush against canvas. And if one stands at the edge of the overgrown drive just before moonrise, they might glimpse a flicker of lamplight in the upper window, though the roof has long since fallen in, and no one has lived there for over a century. There are those who insist the phenomenon ended with Vale's confinement, that the chain of sorrow was severed when the last brush was laid to rest. Yet memory, like mist, clings to stone. In the decades following Croft's disappearance, fragments of his research surfaced in unexpected places. A water-stained notebook in a second-hand bookshop in Edinburgh, a bundle of annotated parish records donated anonymously to the British Library, a single oil portrait wrapped in oilcloth and left on the steps of a museum in Durham. The painting depicted a man in late middle age, dressed in the fashion of the 1880s, his expression calm, but his eyes, those eyes, seemed to hold a depth that shifted with the light. Curators noted with unease that the man bore no resemblance to any known historical figure, yet his features were hauntingly familiar, as though glimpsed in a dream one cannot quite recall upon waking. Within a week of its display, the museum's night watchman was found unconscious in the gallery, muttering about voices in the varnish. He recovered but resigned shortly after, claiming the portrait watched him even when his back was turned. The trail of Edmund Vale, it seemed, refused to go cold. In 1953, a schoolteacher named Margaret Ellery, while cataloguing the estate of a distant relative who had once served as a clerk in the Alnwick magistracy, discovered a sealed tin box containing letters never entered into official records. These were not formal depositions, but private notes, scribbled observations, fragments of overheard conversations, sketches of the Ashgrove studio made from memory by a constable who had accompanied the magistrate. One passage described how, upon entering the main chamber, the air had been thick as velvet and cold, not the damp chill of neglect, but the dry cold of a vault long sealed. Another noted that the floorboards creaked not underfoot, but in empty corners, as though someone or something had just stepped away. Most disturbing was a small charcoal drawing tucked into the back of the folder. A face, half-formed, emerging from shadow, its mouth open in what might have been a sigh or a silent scream. Beneath it, in a trembling hand, were the words, "He did not paint them." They painted him. This notion that Vale was not the author but the instrument began to take root in the quiet corners of academic speculation. A psychiatrist at Maudsley Hospital, reviewing Croft's case files in the 1960s, proposed a theory of retroactive haunting, suggesting that intense emotional imprints could adhere to objects and spaces, exerting a subtle influence on susceptible minds across time. He cited Vale not as a supernatural agent, but as a man whose sensitivity to grief and absence had rendered him porous to the unresolved dead. The portraits, then, were not causes of death, but echoes, visual residues of souls already slipping through the veil, drawn to a hand that could give them form before they faded entirely. It was a theory elegant in its restraint, plausible in its psychology, yet it failed to account for one persistent detail. Every subject Vale painted had been in perfect health before sitting. Their deaths were not preordained. They occurred only after the first stroke of his brush. By the 1980s, Ashgrove had become a site of pilgrimage for a certain kind of seeker, those drawn not by ghosts, but by silence. Photographers came, hoping to capture the peculiar quality of light that pooled in the ruins at twilight. Folklorists recorded the local variants of the tale, each version more layered than the last. One elderly farmer, whose grandfather had once delivered firewood to Vale, claimed the painter never ate in front of others, and that his breath, when he spoke, carried the faint scent of linseed oil and something older, like church incense left too long in a damp crypt. Another recalled how birds would not nest in the trees surrounding Ashgrove, as though the very air repelled life. These testimonies, dismissed as rustic fancy, nonetheless accumulated a weight of their own, a sediment of unease that no rational explanation could fully dissolve. Then, in 1997, a restoration project at a stately home in Cumbria uncovered a hidden compartment behind a false panel in a disused servants' corridor. Inside lay a small wooden box, its surface carved with interlocking spirals resembling neither floral nor geometric motifs, but something older, Celtic perhaps, or pre-Christian. Within the box rested a single miniature portrait, no larger than a palm, painted on ivory. It showed a young woman in a high-collared dress, her hands folded, her gaze directed slightly to the left, as though listening to someone just out of frame. On the reverse, in faded ink, was inscribed, "E.V. for remembrance, though I am gone." No name, no date, but archival cross-referencing revealed that the house had once belonged to a family who, in 1872, had commissioned Edmund Vale for a portrait of their daughter, who died 3 days after the first sitting. The miniature had never been recorded. It should not have existed. And yet there it was, cool to the touch, the paint unnervingly fresh, as if completed only yesterday. This discovery reignited scholarly interest, albeit cautiously. A symposium was held at Oxford, discreetly titled "Visual Mnemonics and Mortuary Anxiety in Late Victorian Art." Papers were read, theories debated, but none could reconcile the empirical with the experiential. For those who had stood before a Vale portrait, even a reproduction, there remained an indelible sense of being seen not by the artist nor by the subject, but by something that existed between them. The space where memory becomes presence, where loss takes shape. Today, only 17 confirmed Vale portraits remain in public or private collections. Each is kept under strict conditions, never displayed for more than 3 months at a time, never lit by direct sunlight, never left unattended overnight. Conservators who work on them speak of an odd stillness that falls over the room, a hush so profound it seems to press against the eardrums. One reported that while cleaning the surface of a portrait of a young boy, she felt a faint vibration beneath her fingertips, as though the canvas itself were breathing. She did not mention it in her official report, and still the question lingers, not as a riddle to be solved, but as a presence to be endured. Did Vale invite the dead, or did they find him? Was his gift a curse or a mercy? Perhaps the truth lies not in causality, but in communion. In a time when death was veiled behind black crepe and whispered euphemisms, when grief was a private burden borne in silence, perhaps the dead simply longed to be seen, not as corpses, not as angels, but as they were in the last full moment of their being. And Vale in his solitude offered them that dignity, at a cost only he could bear. Now Ashgrove Hall stands roofless beneath the Northumbrian sky, its windows gaping like empty eyes. Ivy climbs the walls, obscuring the scars of fire and weather. Yet on certain evenings, when the wind dies and the stars hang sharp and close, a faint golden glow is said to bloom in the upper chamber, though no lamp burns there. And if one listens, not with the ears but with the hollow behind the ribs, one might hear it, the soft, steady scratch of bristles on canvas, and beneath it the quiet weeping of those who have been remembered. The persistence of Edmund Vale's legacy defies the usual erosion of time. While other forgotten artists dissolve into footnotes, his name endures, not in galleries or auction ledgers, but in the hushed recollections of those who have stood too long before one of his works. It is not fame, but resonance, a vibration that lingers in the bones. In the early 2000s, a digital archivist at the National Portrait Gallery, while digitizing a cache of uncatalogued Victorian miniatures, encountered a small oil-on panel bearing no signature but unmistakable stylistic hallmarks. The precise rendering of eyelashes against pallid skin, the way shadow pooled beneath the collarbone like gathered breath. The subject was a man in clerical garb. His expression serene, yet his left hand, resting on a closed book, bore 4 fingers. The 5th was absent, cleanly severed at the knuckle. Curious, the archivist cross-referenced ecclesiastical records and found a match. Reverend Alaric Finch, vicar of a parish near Hexham, who had lost his little finger in a printing press accident in 1869. Finch had died in 1874, 3 days after a visiting artist was noted in the parish ledger. No portrait was ever mentioned in his will, and yet here it was. When the image was uploaded to the internal server, 3 staff members independently reported dreams of walking through an endless hallway lined with closed doors, each bearing a brass plaque engraved with a single name. All 3 awoke with the scent of turpentine on their skin. Such incidents, though never formally documented, accumulated in the margins of institutional memory. Conservators began to speak of Vale protocols, unwritten rules passed down through whispered mentorship. Never work alone on a suspected Vale. Never allow the painting to face your bed at night. Never, under any circumstances, attempt to replicate his technique. One young restorer, disregarding the last, mixed her pigments with rabbit skin glue and walnut oil as period-accurate recipes dictated. By the 3rd evening, she claimed the shadows in her studio deepened unnaturally around her easel, and the figure she was copying, merely a study of drapery from a known Vale background, seemed to shift when she looked away. She abandoned the project. The canvas was later found face down on the floor, though no one had entered the room. What makes Vale's case so resistant to dismissal is not the supernatural, but the uncanny fidelity of the pattern. Death followed his sittings with a regularity that borders on the mathematical, yet no poison, no contagion, no mechanical cause was ever identified. The physician's reports, preserved in brittle county archives, repeat the same phrases: no signs of struggle, lungs clear, heart structurally sound. One coroner, unusually candid in his private journal, wrote, "It is as though life simply stepped aside." This notion that existence itself yielded finds strange corroboration in the few surviving accounts of Vale's working method. He never sketched beforehand. He never asked his subjects to pose for long. Witnesses recalled he would sit in silence for minutes, sometimes an hour, simply observing as though waiting for something to reveal itself. Only then would he begin. And once he did, he never looked away from the canvas, not once, as if he already knew what the face would become. In 2011, a retired pathologist named Dr. Helen Price, whose great-aunt had been painted by Vale and died 4 days later, undertook a private investigation. She located the original death certificates of 12 confirmed subjects and, through painstaking genealogical work, traced living descendants. To her astonishment, nearly every family recounted the same detail. In the hours before death, the subject had spoken of a man who sees through. One woman, on her deathbed, reportedly told her daughter, "He doesn't paint me. He paints the space I'll leave behind." Price compiled her findings into a monograph, privately printed and distributed only to a handful of colleagues. Most dismissed it as grief-stricken fancy, but one, a neurologist specializing in temporal lobe anomalies, noted that such perceptions of being perceived by an absent observer often precede certain forms of atypical seizure activity. Yet none of Vale's subjects showed neurological symptoms. Their minds were clear until the end. Their final words were coherent, often tender. They simply departed. The most unsettling artifact to emerge in recent decades surfaced not in an archive, but in a charity shop in Berwick-upon-Tweed. A volunteer sorting through a box of old frames found a small oval portrait tucked behind a water-damaged landscape. It depicted a girl of about 10, wearing a white pinafore, her hair braided tightly. Her expression was neither happy nor sad, but watchful, as though she knew something the viewer did not. On the reverse, in faint pencil, LM 1873, finished, no surname, no artist mark. Yet infrared analysis later revealed, beneath the surface layer of paint, the ghostly outline of another face, older, male, eyes closed. It was as if Vale had painted over a previous work, not out of economy, but necessity, as though the canvas could only hold one soul at a time. The girl, it was later discovered, matched a child listed in Blackmere's burial register for October 1873, Lydia Mayhew, daughter of a tenant farmer, dead of fever 2 days after her. Entry in the vicar's diary noting portrait. Sitting with Mr. Vale, there is no record of Vale ever painting a child twice. This layering, literal and metaphorical, suggests a theory not of malice, but of containment. Perhaps each portrait was not a conduit for death, but a vessel for it, a way to give form to the moment of transition so that the departed might not linger as wraiths, but pass cleanly into memory. Vale, then, was less a harbinger than a ferryman, his brush a tool of ritual passage. The horror lies not in the deaths themselves, but in the implication that someone must bear witness so completely that they absorb the echo of each departure into their own flesh. His silence in the asylum was not madness, but exhaustion, the soul worn thin by too much seeing. Even now, Ashgrove exerts a quiet pull. In 2019, a group of urban explorers entered the ruins, armed with cameras and bravado. They posted footage online, shaky images of collapsed staircases, walls stained with rain and time. But in one clip, lasting only 3 seconds, the beam of a flashlight catches the far wall of what was once the studio. For a single frame, the plaster appears smooth, unbroken, and upon it, the faint outline of a face, eyes open, mouth slightly parted. The video was deleted within hours. The uploader's account vanished. When questioned, the remaining members of the group refused to speak of it, though one was later heard to mutter, "He's still finishing them." And so the story circles, like mist around a gravestone. There are no answers, only deeper questions wrapped in velvet silence. Vale left no manifesto, no confession, no key to his sorrow. Only the portraits remain, each a threshold, each a plea. To look upon one is to stand at the edge of a room where someone has just left, the air still trembling with their absence. You feel the warmth of their chair. You hear the echo of their step. And for a breath you are certain, if you turn quickly enough, you will see them, but you never do. Instead, you are left with the sound that follows, the soft, ceaseless scratch of a brush on canvas, continuing long after the painter has gone. The silence surrounding Edmund Vale has never been absolute. It merely deepens with distance, like the hush that follows a bell's final toll. In 2023, during routine renovations at the former county asylum near York, workmen uncovered a sealed alcove behind crumbling plaster in what had once been the East Wing infirmary. Inside lay not bones or relics, but a single oak panel, roughly 2 feet square, its surface coated in decades of dust, yet remarkably preserved. Etched into the wood, not painted but incised with meticulous, almost devotional precision, was a face, not rendered in pigment but carved in negative space, grooves for eyes, a hollow for a mouth, the suggestion of cheekbones formed by shallow depressions. There was no signature, no date, yet the style bore Vale's unmistakable imprint, the same uncanny stillness, the same sense of suspended breath. Most disturbing was the texture. When conservators later examined it under raking light, they found the grooves filled with a fine, chalky residue that analysis identified as ground bone, human, though too degraded for specific origin. The panel was catalogued, sealed in climate-controlled storage, and quietly omitted from public records. Yet those who handled it reported an odd phenomenon. For days afterward, they dreamed not of faces, but of hands, pale, slender fingers tracing the air just beyond their vision, as if searching for a canvas that was no longer there. This discovery reignited a quiet debate among a select circle of historians and parapsychologists. Was Vale's practice evolving even in confinement? Had his art transcended pigment, becoming something more primal, a direct transcription of presence onto surface, using whatever medium remained? Letters from asylum staff, long buried in regional archives, now took on new significance. One orderly noted that Vale, in his final years, would spend hours pressing his palms against the walls of his cell, muttering about making room. Another recalled finding him kneeling before a puddle of rainwater on the floor, staring into it as though it held a reflection not his own. These were dismissed as symptoms of dementia, but viewed through the lens of the oak panel, they suggest something else entirely. A man so attuned to the threshold between life and aftermath that he could render it in any substance, even absence itself. Meanwhile, the portraits continued their quiet migration through the world. In 2024, a private collector in Geneva auctioned a previously unknown Vale miniature under strict anonymity. It depicted a woman in mourning dress, her veil lifted just enough to reveal eyes that seemed to follow the viewer with unnerving specificity. The buyer, a reclusive heiress known for her interest in Victorian spiritualism, displayed it in her library for precisely 11 days. On the 12th morning, she was found seated before it, pulse steady, breath even, but unresponsive, as though her mind had stepped out and forgotten to return. She remains in that state today, sustained by medical care, her gaze fixed on a point just above the mantel where the portrait once hung. It was removed immediately, crated and shipped to an undisclosed location. Yet her nurses report that on still nights, she smiles faintly, as if listening to a voice only she can hear. Such events resist scientific taxonomy, yet they accumulate a kind of evidentiary weight through repetition. A pattern emerges not of violence but of invitation. Vale's subjects did not scream. They did not writhe. They simply ceased to be present, in body, yes, but more profoundly in attention, as though their consciousness had been gently untethered and drawn into the painted plane, leaving behind only the husk of flesh. This notion finds eerie support in a fragment of diary recovered from Croft's effects in 1927, now held in a locked drawer at the Bodleian. I have stood before the Harrow portrait for 3 nights running. Last evening, I swear the light in her eyes shifted, from candle glow to moonlight, as though she had turned her head while I blinked. And this morning, my reflection in the glass showed me wearing a cravat I do not own. The entry ends there. The next page is torn out. What then was the nature of Vale's pact, if pact there was? No occult texts were found in his belongings. No sigils marked his studio floor. His only known reading, according to the Ashgrove inventory, consisted of theological treatises, botanical illustrations, and a well-worn copy of Dante's Purgatorio. Perhaps his ritual was not one of invocation, but of witness. In an age that sanitized death behind curtains and euphemism, Vale offered the dying a rare gift, to be seen fully, without flinching, in the moment they began to slip away. And in return, they gave him their final image, not as memory, but as essence. The portraits were not records of the dead, but vessels for the act of dying itself, suspended in perpetuity. To view one was not to look at a person, but to stand beside them at the edge of the veil. This interpretation gains poignancy when considering Vale's own end. He died in 1881, not with a gasp or a cry, but so quietly that the night attendant did not notice until morning. His bed was empty of struggle, his hands folded over his chest, as though in prayer or repose. On the wall opposite, scrawled in charcoal so faint it was nearly missed, were 3 words, "They are here." Beneath them, the plaster bore the faint impression of many small hands overlapping, as if pressed against the surface from the other side. Even now, Ashgrove refuses to surrender its secrets entirely. In the spring of 2025, a team from the University of Newcastle conducted a ground-penetrating radar survey of the estate grounds, ostensibly to map subsidence risks. Their equipment malfunctioned repeatedly near the old studio foundation, registering phantom structures, walls, doorways, even furniture that matched no architectural plans. When they switched to acoustic resonance imaging, the sensors picked up a low-frequency hum, consistent with the vibration of stretched canvas in a draft. There was no canvas. There was no draft. Yet the sound persisted for 17 minutes before ceasing abruptly, as though someone had closed a door, and so the legend endures, not as folklore, but as a lingering atmospheric condition, a pressure in certain rooms, a chill in certain galleries, a silence that feels less like emptiness and more like waiting. Those who study Vale inevitably find themselves changed. They speak more softly. They avoid mirrors at night. They develop a habit of glancing over their shoulder, not in fear, but in expectation, as though someone they once knew might step into view, wearing clothes from another century, holding a brush still damp with oil. For the truth, if there is one, maybe this. Edmund Vale did not paint the dead. He painted the space between breaths, the fragile instant when a soul realizes it is no longer bound to bone. And in doing so, he opened a door that never fully closed. The portraits are not windows into the past, but thresholds. And sometimes in the right light, at the edge of sleep, you can feel them watching back, not with hunger but with gratitude. For you remember them, and in remembering, you keep the door ajar. On still nights when the wind stills and the stars hang low over Northumberland, the ruins of Ashgrove seem less like a ruin and more like a chamber held in suspension. And if you stand at the broken threshold long enough, you might hear it. Not a voice, not a footstep, but the soft, patient scratch of bristles on canvas, continuing its work in the dark. The phenomenon surrounding Edmund Vale has in recent years ceased to be merely historical. It has become environmental, not in the sense of contagion but of atmosphere, a subtle shift in the air, a change in the quality of silence that those sensitive to such things report upon encountering his works, or even places associated with him. In 2026, a young art historian named Eliza Thorne, no relation to the apothecary widow of Blackmere, though she bore the same name by coincidence, was granted rare access to a private collection in the Scottish borders where a Vale portrait had resided unseen for over a century. The painting depicted a man in his late 30s, dressed in the uniform of a Royal Engineers officer, his expression calm, but his eyes unnervingly direct. Within hours of her arrival, Thorne noted that the clocks in the manor ran slow, not by minutes, but by an inconsistent, almost organic lag, as though time itself hesitated in the room's presence. More curiously, the scent of dried lavender and linseed oil clung to the air, though no such substances were stored nearby. She spent 3 days transcribing marginalia from the collector's ancestral letters, during which she recorded in her own journal, "I feel watched not from the painting but through it, as if it is a lens, and something on the other side is looking back with patient curiosity." Thorne's notes, later published in a limited academic journal before being quietly withdrawn at the collector's request, introduced a new hypothesis, that Vale's portraits do not depict individuals, but intersections, moments where a life briefly overlapped with a deeper current of collective absence. She pointed to recurring motifs across verified works, the slight tilt of the head, as if listening, the hands always partially obscured, as though withdrawing, the background never fully rendered, dissolving instead into a soft, granular grey that resembles neither shadow nor fog, but the visual equivalent of static. "He was not painting people," she wrote. "He was painting the moment they ceased to belong to the world of the living and began to belong to memory itself." Her theory gained little traction in mainstream circles, yet among a small network of conservators, archivists and folklorists, it resonated with unsettling clarity. One conservator in Edinburgh confessed that every time she worked on a veil, her own reflection in the varnish seemed to age, slightly, wrinkles appearing at the corners, of her eyes that vanished once she stepped away. This sense of temporal slippage finds eerie corroboration in a recently declassified Home Office memo from 1875, discovered in 2027 during a digitization project at the National Archives. Though heavily redacted, it references anomalous reports from Northumberland concerning temporal dissonance in proximity to certain artworks and recommends that no further sittings be permitted under any circumstances. The document ends with a handwritten addendum. "The man does not kill. He records the already gone. Do not look too long. The author's name is blacked out, but the ink matches that used by the Alnwick magistrate who first inspected Ashgrove Hall, suggesting that even the most rational minds of the era were shaken by what they witnessed." Meanwhile, the physical remnants of Vale's life continue to surface in unexpected contexts. In 2028, a team restoring the organ at Blackmere's St. Cuthbert's Church discovered, tucked inside a disused pipe, a rolled sheet of vellum bearing a single charcoal sketch, a child's hand, palm upturned, fingers slightly curled, as if holding something invisible. The lines were unmistakably Vale's, fluid, economical, charged with latent emotion. Beneath it in faded brown ink the words, "She let go." No name, no date. Yet parish records confirm that in November 1873, a girl named Agnes Pike, aged 8, drowned in the mill stream after reportedly reaching for something in the water that wasn't there. Her death occurred 4 days after her mother mentioned to the vicar that Mr. Vale asked to sketch her. The sketch was placed in a sealed case and stored in the church vestry. Within a week, the church cat, which had never shown interest in the organ loft, was found sitting atop the pipe every evening at dusk, staring into the empty space where the vellum had been. Such discoveries reinforce the growing consensus among those who study Vale that his work was not confined to canvas. He used whatever surface presented itself, plaster, wood, paper, even skin, if the asylum records are to be believed. A nurse's log from 1879 notes that Vale, in a rare moment of lucidity, traced a face onto his own forearm with a fingernail, weeping as he did so. The marks faded by morning, but the implication lingers. His art was not about preservation, but transference. Each portrait was a vessel into which a departing soul could pour its final awareness, ensuring it would not scatter into oblivion, but remain coherent, visible, remembered. In this light, the deaths were not caused by Vale. They were facilitated by him. He offered the dying a final act of dignity, to be seen wholly and without judgment as they crossed over. The horror lies not in the dying, but in the realization that someone must bear the weight of that witnessing, and that the act of remembrance can be as consuming as fire. This burden may explain Vale's descent into silence. To look so deeply into the moment of departure is to risk being pulled across with it. His asylum years were not madness, but retreat, a necessary withdrawal from a world grown unbearably thin, where every face carried the echo of those he had helped release. And yet, even in confinement, he could not stop. The carved panel, the wall inscriptions, the sketches on scraps of paper, all suggest an irrepressible compulsion to continue the work, as though the dead still queued outside his cell, waiting for their turn to be seen. Today, the few remaining Vale portraits are rarely displayed. When they are, it is under strict conditions, low light, limited viewing time, no photography. Museums that have exhibited them report an unusual number of visitors, lingering far longer than average, often returning day after day, standing before the same painting in silent contemplation. Some weep without knowing why. Others leave small offerings, dried flowers, polished stones, handwritten notes folded and tucked into coat pockets. None are ever collected. They vanish by morning, as though absorbed into the frame, and still Ashgrove calls. Not with sound, but with absence. Those who walk its grounds speak of a peculiar stillness, a silence so complete it seems to hum. Birds fall quiet. Insects cease their chirring. Even the wind appears to hold its breath. In that hush, one becomes acutely aware of one's own pulse, one's own breath, as though the land itself is measuring the span of your presence against those who came before. And if you stay long enough, you may feel it, not a touch, not a voice, but the faintest pressure against your ribs, as though something just behind you is leaning forward, brush in hand, waiting for you to turn so it can begin. For the truth may be this: Vale did not stop painting when he died. He simply changed mediums. Now he paints with memory, with silence, with the space between heartbeats. And every time someone remembers a face that should be forgotten, every time someone stands too long before an empty wall and feels watched, he adds another stroke to a canvas that has no edge, no frame, no end. On the coldest nights of the year, when frost etches silver veins across the windows of Northumberland, the locals say you can hear it not in the air, but in the bones, the soft, eternal scratch of bristles on the void, still rendering the gone into grace.